Hey, Gold Creek. My name is Pablo. I'm the worship pastor at the Mill Creek campus, and I am with...
This is Pastor Brian from Woodinville.
Hey, so glad to have you guys join us on day 6 on the 365-day Bible reading plan. Today, we're focusing on 2 passages. The first passage we're focusing on is Genesis chapter 15. Cool. And just to give you guys a little bit of context of that passage, this is the time where God had called Abraham out of his land, out of his country, out of everything that he knows. And mind you, this is at the age of 75, right? At the ripe old age of 75.
Spring chicken.
Right? He calls him and he says, hey, I'm going to take you to a land that I have promised you, and I'm going to bless you. And in this moment where we're reading right here, God has already blessed him abundantly with livestock, with silver and gold. So, and back in those days, I mean, the more goats and cows you had, right? The richer you were. Yeah. So God has already blessed him, but he's missing one thing. And Abraham says, God, you're offering me and promising me all these things, but I have no heir. I have no child. And so in verses 2 and 3, it feels like he's kind of like upset at God, and he's kind of almost throwing this fit. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've done that at certain times where I'm like, God, but what about this? But you've promised me this and that. And even in spite of doing all that, God still promises so many things to him, right? Yeah. And in that moment, he says, God, you haven't given me a child. You haven't given me an heir. He says, you know what? I'm just going to take one of my servants and he's going to be my heir. But God says no, right? He says no. And he says one specific thing. He tells him that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Man, God is so good in that sense, because even when we throw fits or we feel that we have all these excuses or God's not doing it the way we want him to, God just says, hey, just relax. I got it under control and I'm going to bless you, right? And so, and even starts in verse 1 where God tells him that he is a shield and his very great reward. So I think something that really spoke to me in that moment is, even if God doesn't give us all the things that we want, if we have God in our lives, he is that reward. He is all that we need. And that's been the biggest thing to me. Like, wow, that is so true. How do I keep from making all these other things that God has promised me, or materialistic things, or whatever God has promised me? How can I still be happy if God just says, hey, I changed my mind, I'm not going to do that? Though he won't do that because he's faithful, right? Yeah. But how can we be just happy with God being our reward and everything that we need? And a very popular verse here is verse 6, where it says, and Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. I think that's such a powerful statement there, because in spite of all these things and all these questions that Abram had at that moment, and he still chose to believe. And the Bible says that the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. So Brian, let me ask you, in your opinion, what does that mean? What does this verse mean to you? Why does it say that the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith?
You know what? I want to back up and follow up on this verse. Is he was called when he was 75. My first thought originally was, you're never done with God. God always has a new vision. God always has a new purpose for us. And what happens sometimes is there's like life stages where we're singles, so we're doing a certain type of ministry, and then we have kids, and then your whole life shifts and you're doing kind of ministry that way. And sometimes, if we're not careful, when we switch life stages, we sometimes, or I've seen people drop faith. When this is the perfect opportunity, so no matter what life stage we're in, God calls you to a new thing. God was calling Abraham to a new thing. I think, now this is the Brian translation, I think he was credited to him as righteous because he's been through all these stages of life, and now he's taking the greatest risk without any reward, and he's choosing God.
Yeah.
I think that is, or at least that's what popped out to me, was the fact that, man, I mean, the great risk of having all this wealth, but then not being able to pass it on to anybody. The greatest risk of, I'm 75, what am I going to do? The greatest risk of the fact of, like, I'm not protected, right? Like, part of this whole calling was he was being called out of his protective zone of family.
Out of his comfort zone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's funny because at least in my case, I'm not sure if you guys ever experienced this, or you, Brian,
Yeah.
have ever experienced this, but we want something and we pray to God about it. And after maybe like the third time, we're just like, God, where are you in this? Why isn't this happening? Or maybe we're praying for healing, for a new job, or for a job in general, right? For a raise, something, whatever you might be praying for. Don't forget that Abram was 75 at the time that God, called him and said, hey, I'm going to start doing this thing with you. Yeah. I'm going to start making your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. And to me, it's like, okay, maybe I've just been a big old baby and just like, I want it now, God, right? And I start stomping. But that just teaches me, no matter how old you are, no matter how long you've waited, God is still working, and he's still reminding us that he is faithful. Yeah. And this is a perfect example of that. Is there anything about this passage that you've read, or that kind of maybe doesn't make too much sense, or maybe not so much that you don't understand, but maybe kind of raises an eyebrow or a question?
Not necessarily. I could imagine if you're reading the 1 Year Bible for the very first time, I know this leads up to the first covenant, right? Like the thing that sets up us as Christians thousands of years later. It can seem impossible when he says your ancestors or your offspring are going to outnumber the sky. Well, what he's speaking here is what he's saying here is what I think he understands is like, you're going to be the father of not only a nation, you're going to be the father of like a faith, an entire like faith.
That's so good.
I don't know. I think when you read it at face value, you're like, how are you going to have that many kids? But I think what he's saying is you're going to be the father of an entire faith.
I think that's great. And I'm going to add one little thing to that before we move on. It's such a huge deal to me because we have the Bible, right? We read the story. We could flip pages and be like, oh, wow, look at the nation that Israel became, right? And the impact that it had in the world. And because of the obedience and the faith that one man had, look at the domino effect it had everywhere. Yeah. We have the Bible to actually reference that. Abram at that time, he just had to take God for his word and just say, okay, God, I believe you. It's not like he could just go to the end of the book and say, look at what God did with everything that he promised me. And that to me speaks volumes. It's like, what have you been praying for? What have you been asking for? What have you been doing that you still haven't seen the fruit of it? Hey, let me let you in on a little secret. You might not ever. That's just like mind blowing to me. You might not ever, but guess what? If you're faithful to God, if you believe in him and know and just obey, then at that point, I feel like maybe your kids will see that. And your grandchildren so even if you don't see it in your lifetime, believe that God is faithful and that he will be faithful through your sons and your daughters and their kids and so on from generation to generation. So I think that's just amazing. And I think that's such a just great passage. Let's switch gears here a little bit now to Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 through 48. So there's so much rich content here in these passages, literally straight from Jesus's mouth, right? This is the greatest sermon ever preached, the Sermon on the Mount. And in these passages, Jesus starts turning all these things upside down and starts raising eyebrows and just starts shaking people like, okay, what are you saying right now? And so you've probably heard a little bit of it in the earlier days of this podcast that we're doing. But here, what I want to focus on is verse 27 through 48. And he talks about anyone who lusts commits adultery, right? It's no longer an action. You're now sinning through your mind, through your intentions, through what no one sees inside of you, right? He talks about divorce and adultery and how that ties in together. He talks about not swearing by heaven and what we know today as, swearing by God, right? When you say, I swear to God and things like that. He says, and this one makes me chuckle. He says, if someone slaps you, what does he say?
Turn your other cheek, right?
Turn your other cheek, right? And that's just like, that just hits me right in my pride. Because it's almost comical. But it's true and it's right. And that's what Jesus expects from us, right? He also says, don't just love your neighbor. He says, not only love your enemies, but also pray for them. He's going against everything that society and our culture has taught us, right? An eye for an eye or, things like that. And he's just shaking people. And that's what I love about Jesus. He's not afraid to just come and
Flip things over.
flip everything completely and make people like, what? What's going on?
Yeah.
So I think this is one of the greatest things. So out of the things that I just mentioned, which one kind of stands out to you that's just like makes you raise your eyebrow?
I mean, he laid it down for us men talking about lust, right? It's not about the physical act anymore. Now it's about our mind. It's about our heart. It's where we're thinking about things, where we're letting our heart go.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a huge challenge for us in the best way possible. That improves my marriage.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother sermon, right? But that improves
Absolutely.
my marriage when I protect my thoughts, when I protect my heart.
Yeah. And that's so good. I've heard people put it in describe it in this way. They said that if there was no one looking and you had the opportunity and someone assured you that you'd never get caught, would you still do it?
That's integrity. That's exactly right.
Right.
Yep.
And that's what Jesus is alluding to here. He's saying, if you had the opportunity, would you do it? And there was no consequences. There's no repercussions. Would you still do it?
Yeah.
And that's something that we got to look within ourselves and ask, right? And God is trying to get to the nitty gritty of your heart.
Yep.
Jesus is trying to get to there and say, hey, I need to clean all that out. So it's not only a matter of actions, it's a matter of intentions, of integrity, of what's in here, right?
Yep.
That's what Jesus was always worried about. How's your heart? Not what you look like on the outside, or hey, I'm this pastor, I'm this worship pastor, I lead this church, right? It's if you had the opportunity, what would you do, right? So that's a huge one. Is there anyone from the ones that I mentioned that we read in this passage, is there anything that maybe doesn't make that much sense to you or something you don't understand?
No, what I love about Jesus, he's a straight shooter, right? I really appreciate that. I feel like Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, was meant for regular people like us. It's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, that's awesome. Jesus keeps it simple. He keeps it clear.
Yep.
And he says, this is right. This is wrong. Don't let anyone else tell you differently.
Yep.
I think my biggest takeaway, and I'm going to end with this, my biggest takeaway from these passages are in verses 46 and 48. And it says, if you love only those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much. Man, that's just so good. If you are kind only to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even pagans do that. But you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. And I think that's just so good. That's just so good. If evil people know how to do good things for their friends, for their family members, we got to go above and beyond that and not do that just for those who we love. Yeah. But as I was reading earlier, to love our enemies and even pray for them. Let me ask you a question, guys. When's the last time you prayed for your enemy? When's the last time you prayed for the boss who makes your life miserable at work, who you just want to quit? When's the last time you prayed for him and said, God, I hope you bless him? Yeah. That's what Jesus is doing and flipping everything. Totally. Because our natural human nature and our response, we just want to see them just get their payback, right? Yeah. Or get their day, whatever's coming to them. But Jesus is saying no, because God, the Father, has loved and blessed us. Even when we were sinful, he came and he died on the cross for us, right? Yeah. He wants us to do the same. Yep. And so I think that's just a great way to end this time. Thank you guys for joining, and make sure you tune in for day 7. God bless you guys.